Today, we're literally going to change the way you look at the sky, and specifically, how you see the most popular single-engine aircraft ever made, the Cessna 172. I don't want you to just think of this thing as a vehicle anymore. Instead, we're going to look at this plane as a living, breathing, mechanical organism. Together, we're going to dissect it layer by layer, starting right from its outer aluminum shell and diving all the way down into its digital heartbeat. But before we break out the scalpels, I want to hook you with this number, 2,550. That is the maximum takeoff weight in pounds of this aircraft. I mean, just imagine taking well over a ton of metal, fuel, and human cargo and somehow hoisting it thousands of feet up into the air. It sounds like magic, but it's actually just pure physics and absolutely brilliant engineering. So how exactly does this machine pull that off? Well, here's our agenda for today. We'll start with number 1, the airplane's skeleton. Then 2, the heart of the aircraft. 3, the flight control surfaces. And finally 4, we'll go inside the cockpit brain. Okay, kicking things off with section 1, the airplane skeleton, exploring the airframe. Let's begin our pre-flight walk-around right on the outside, looking at the very bones that give the airplane its shape. So the whole foundation of our mechanical organism is the airframe. In aviation, this term simply refers to the protective shell and skeleton that we see resting on the tarmac. It's basically the entire structure of the aircraft, just minus the engine and the avionics. Inside the fuselage, it's a mix of aluminum formers, bulkheads, longerons, and stringers working together. It's kind of like a giant, super strong puzzle. And out in the wings, you have ribs that perfectly maintain that specific airfoil shape, which is absolutely crucial for efficiently producing lift. Running the whole length of those wings are spars, giving them massive strength. But hey, it's not actually all rigid aluminum. Take a look at the main landing gear. That requires flexible steel to absorb the tremendous forces of a hard landing. Now, here's a totally wild detail: the hidden color of the skeleton. If you actually peel back the outer aluminum sheets on a lot of these planes, the internal structure is vividly green or yellow. What you're seeing is a primer layer of zinc chromate or zinc phosphate. It basically acts as a protective skin treatment. It seals the aluminum surfaces to prevent corrosion over decades and decades of flying. Moving right along to section 2, heart of the aircraft, the power plant and fuel. We are transitioning inward from the skeleton directly to the muscles of our aircraft. And man, what a heart it is. The Cessna 172 we're looking at relies on the legendary Lycoming IO360. This is a 4-cylinder, horizontally opposed engine pushing out up to 225 horsepower. It uses a direct drive, meaning all that power goes straight to the fixed-pitch propeller without any complex gear reductions getting in the way. Plus, it breathes the sky. It's entirely air-cooled, pulling in air from those really recognizable openings right on the nose. But it does way more than just spin the prop. It runs the alternator for your electricity, a vacuum pump for your instruments, and it even provides the heat for the cabin. Let's look at how this builds that continuous rhythm of power. This is a 4-stroke engine, which means every single piston does this exact 4-step dance: intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust, every 2 revolutions. And because each of the 4 cylinders is always in a different stroke at any given time, there's constantly 1 cylinder in the combustion phase. That's what gives the plane its smooth, uninterrupted heartbeat. Now, to keep that heart beating, aviation engines normally use either a carburetor or fuel injection. The older carburetor setup relies on pure mechanics and the Venturi effect, basically a lower pressure suction, to mix air and fuel before it ever hits the cylinder. But our Lycoming IO360 uses modern fuel injection. It is vastly more efficient because it uses electronic sensors to perfectly calculate and then inject fuel right at the cylinder heads at the exact perfect moment. Running that injection system means you need fuel, specifically 100 low-lead aviation gas, which is actually distinctively blue, stored up in its 2 wing tanks. But check out this capacity breakdown because it's super important. The tanks hold 56 gallons total, but only 53 gallons are actually usable. 3 of those gallons are essentially unreachable during normal flight angles. So you definitely want to calculate your flight times based on the 53 usable gallons, not the full 56, for sure. The absolute biggest deal up there is safety. I mean, you can't exactly pull over to the side of a cloud if something breaks, right? That's exactly why every cylinder has 2 spark plugs instead of 1, and they're driven by 2 totally independent magnetos. These magnetos generate the electric discharge to ignite the fuel, and they are physically rotated by the engine itself. So if the airplane suffers a massive, total electrical failure, the mechanical heart just keeps on beating because those magnetos do not need the battery to keep firing. All right, Section 3, Flight Control Surfaces, or as I call them, the limbs of the aircraft. Now that we've got structure and power, our organism actually needs limbs to steer. Let's examine them. Think about it like this. A pilot's physical movements inside the cabin instantly translate into aerodynamic forces outside. Turning the yoke left or right moves the ailerons on the wings, making the plane roll along its longitudinal axis. Pushing or pulling the yoke moves the elevator on the tail, pitching the nose up or down along the lateral axis. And finally, pressing the foot pedals moves the rudder, yawing the nose left or right along the vertical axis. But flying isn't quite as simple as just turning the steering wheel on your car, and that's largely due to this quirky physics problem called adverse yaw. When you turn the yoke to roll into a turn, the mechanics of the ailerons create drag that literally pulls the nose in the opposite direction. So to execute a really smooth, coordinated turn, a pilot has to apply a bit of rudder with their feet at the exact same moment they're turning the yoke with their hands. Beyond those primary controls, we've got our secondary controls, the flaps. You can kind of think of these as shape shifters for the wings. They deploy in steps of 10, 20, and 30 degrees, and they physically increase the camber, or the curve of the wing. This is a huge deal because it allows the plane to generate much more lift at lower speeds, making them totally essential for taking off and landing safely. But a quick warning, if you deploy them while flying too fast, the extreme wind resistance can severely compromise the structural integrity of the flap mechanisms and even the whole wing itself. Which brings us to our final stop, Section 4, Inside the Cockpit Brain, covering avionics and instruments. Let's step inside to see the nervous system that actually monitors everything we've been talking about. So remember our hook number from the very beginning, 2,550 pounds maximum takeoff weight? Well, breaking that down visually, once you account for the empty weight of the plane itself, you are left with a max useful load of just 878 pounds. That single number has to handle the weight of your pilot, all your passengers, any baggage, and all that heavy blue aviation fuel in the wings. Weight management is literally the very first thing the cockpit brain has to calculate before ever leaving the ground. Once you're actually up in the air, modern aviators are generally relying on the Garmin G1000. It transforms that overwhelming cluster of old-school dials into a really sleek, dual-screen digital brain. On the left, the primary flight display, or PFD, gives you your immediate, critical flight status, your airspeed, altitude, and your horizon attitude. Then on the right, the multifunction display, or MFD, handles the broader picture stuff like engine health, fuel gauges, and your GPS moving map. But hey, a brain is literally useless without senses, right? So where does the Garmin get all this data? From some seriously ingenious physical sensors out on the exterior of the plane. The pitot tube under the left wing takes in ram air to figure out your airspeed. The static port on the side of the fuselage measures outside atmospheric pressure to determine your altitude. And remember that vacuum pump we mentioned on the engine? Well, it exists to literally spin the analog backup gyroscopes on the dashboard, totally independent of the digital screens, just in case the entire electrical system goes dark. We'll officially wrap up our walk-around by turning on the lights. Now, this setup doesn't just look cool, it legally communicates the aircraft's status to the world. A flashing red beacon on the tail warns the ground crew that the engine is about to start. Blinding white strobes flash for anti-collision visibility. The red, green, and white navigation lights show exactly which direction the plane is flying in the pitch black. And finally, the landing lights pierce the darkness to show the pilot the runway. Which leaves us with one really big final thought. When you combine that anti-corrosive skeleton, the totally redundant mechanical heart, the precise aerodynamic limbs, and that brilliant digital meets analog brain, is the Cessna 172 the ultimate masterpiece of accessible engineering? The next time you hear that hum and look up into the clouds, remember, you aren't just looking at a vehicle. You are watching a meticulously crafted organism of physics conquering the air exactly as it was designed to do.